Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is John Malanka with the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. I don't know to your left, but to my left is Dr. Jordan Tishler. We have Dr. Adam Abodeely. We have Dr. Jehan Marcu, as well as a new guest here, Dr. Min An. And he is I'll say our resident pharmacist today for our casual conversation. And so we've done quite a few of these, and the topic keeps on coming up about is cannabis and other pharmaceuticals, a drug-to-drug interaction safe? And if that's the topic we're talking about. So welcome, guys. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So, Min, good to have you on. Thank you for being part of our casual conversation. And so let's start with you. I know currently you're in the East Coast in New York City, but originally from the West Coast, and living in the middle of our country. So you're a pharmacist, but can you share a little background of your pharmacy experience, but also talking about drug-to-drug interactions and why a medical expert should be involved? Not only a medical doctor, but also a pharmacist.
Yeah, so I got into the cannabis space when I was working at a pain clinic. It was an outpatient pain clinic, and that's where I discovered Cannabis Medicine. It was never taught to us. Like, I didn't learn about the ECS system, but then when I did a little self-education, it kind of really opened my eyes and answered a lot of the questions that I still had after graduating. And so I'm fairly new to the cannabis space. It's been about a year now, but it's been the best decision I've made so far in terms of my career. And and to answer your second question, I think it's really important because cannabis is medicine and it's still metabolized by the CYP450 enzyme that specifically like 3A4 that metabolizes like over 60% of prescription drugs today. So drug interactions are real, and it's really important to monitor and take it with guidance.
With guidance, and so titrating down, but also, I work with a lot of patients, and I'm certain you all do as well, that are finding the benefits of pharmaceuticals with cannabinoid, not taking the full amount. When I say finding the benefits, another colleague that's part of the ACS who's on our board, she's been battling fibromyalgia for the past 22 years, and when she discovered cannabis, she's also a nurse. She was able to drop her milligram dosing down to minimal, as well as use 2 to 5 milligrams of cannabis, and still have the same amount that she was getting as I'll say a 25 milligram pharmaceutical. And so she's seeing the benefits of that with a lot of other patients. So I don't want people to be afraid. If you're going to use cannabis, stop this. Can you share that? Because I know that is a warning that, when you go to a pharmacist, is don't drive, don't drink, don't use other pharmaceuticals or narcotics. Can you talk about that, the importance of that too, please?
Yeah, so well, in terms of so cannabinoids have the synergistic analgesic effect because it works alongside the opioid receptors. So oftentimes, well, I've personally seen many patients like reduce their opioid doses by adding on cannabis as medicine because it provides that synergistic pain relieving effect. And so that's what I've personally seen. Everybody has their own endocannabinoid system, and there's a lot of variables that come into play. But yeah, cannabis is being used as adjunct for symptomatic relief. There are some patients that have found ailments to be, cured with cannabis alone. But yeah, as of right now, the evidence really points to cannabis being used as adjunctive treatment for symptomatic control on some sort of disease state.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Let's go with Jehan. Jehan, I know you do a lot talk about safety, and that's one of your I guess key talking. You're always being invited to talk about safety, and this industry has so many gray areas, I should say. And when I say safety, currently cannabis is scheduled as a Schedule 1 federally legal Schedule 1 narcotic with no medical benefits. Can you talk about that listing, but also talk about Epidiolex, which I don't know if it's a government involved, but putting it a Schedule 5. And but can you talk about the difference of one? And you don't need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but talk about one and why Epidiolex is a Schedule 5.
Great question. So aside from Schedule 1, a scheduled drug is typically a finished product that's packaged and labeled and approved for conditions. That's why THC in different forms appears in different categories. So let's, Schedule 3 will count down 3, 2, 1. Yeah, Schedule 3 will find Marinol, an encapsulated suspension in oil, essentially THC. While it is synthetic, any entrepreneurs out there could source it apparently from NIDA and make generic versions of it because it's now off patent, but no one has done that yet. Then you move on down to Schedule 2. There we find a more dangerous version of THC, and that's in the liquid suspension. So basically, you take that capsule, you open it, and you just have the liquid and sort of administered in a dropper style, just conceptually. It's a liquid suspension. Again, by Syndros, that's a Schedule 2. Now, if you put it in the most dangerous form, which is in the plant material, that is a Schedule 1. It's all THC. It's just a matter of whether or not it has cellulose, it's in a liquid suspension or in a pill, and sort of how much data is recognized. Not how much exists, not all available data, but what is recognized to fulfill the requirements for inclusion for making a judgment about its medical use. And so I think part of the issue that we're struggling with right now is that there is a great mechanism to put drugs in Schedule 1. You need very little evidence, apparently, to put drugs in Schedule 1. You don't like it, just put it in Schedule 1 before you have any data about it, and there it'll stay. There aren't great mechanisms to get products out of Schedule 1. Because again, scheduling is generally reserved for packaged products. And when you take a product like Epidiolex, which is purified CBD from cannabis plants, I'll say that again, from cannabis plants, a clearly superior choice for CBD. This is, again, a highly purified extract from cannabis plants of CBD, a very, 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 very pure form, highly purified, 99.9% like that. And that is in a liquid suspension. And it is now, I believe, been descheduled. It was in Schedule 5, but now been descheduled because of its safety profile. But again, what's interesting about CBD is that there are thousands of adverse events reported every year because of the population that uses it. And I think it's an important point to bring up when we think about these products and Schedule 1, 2, 3, and not scheduled. We have to think about a couple things. Do they cause impairment is one question to ask. The other is, why do we see adverse events associated with it? And it could be because brittle populations are using them. And is there a pharmacological difference you might be thinking between THC found in Schedule 1, 2, and 3? No, there's no pharmacological difference. It's just a matter of its form, and if that form has been studied and approved by the DEA and the FDA. So I think that is one of the concerns. And, just again, to tie it back to sort of drug interactions and safety, what we really want to think about when people take products is more and more about their genotype. Like, what genes do they have? What other medications are they taking? Because you could have a certain genetic profile, make you on the spectrum of slow to ultra fast metabolizer, or you could have a drug that interferes with metabolism of the drug. And why does that matter? Because you can affect the bioavailability of the drug or the rate of the drug clearance from your body. So bioavailability, the best analogy I've ever heard is bioavailability is people get on a bus and the bus makes a stop. How many people get off the bus is bioavailability. Now, if some jerk, let's call it a CYP inhibitor, gets on the bus and prevents people from leaving, that bus is just going to drive around and people are going to get off wherever, versus sort of getting off in a clear, predictable manner. So again, when we think about these substances and we think about safety, it's always good to think about a lot of factors. What else are people consuming? Do they have a history of issues with metabolizing certain drugs to the liver? And, Jordan, I think, I've heard you talk a lot about the different administration forms, inhalation and oral. And sometimes taking an oral drug is not a great idea, especially if people are taking a lot of medications, as I understand it. And inhalation can be great because you don't, it still gets processed by the liver, but you miss that first pass. There's a bit of a delay there. But John, I hope that answers your question for me.
It does. And let me pass the baton over to Dr. Tishler and Dr. Abodeely as well. You know, can you share what you've seen with your patients when it comes to things that really stand out? Heart medicine, blood thinners, et cetera. And so why a medical professional should be involved. You know, that's something I always share with everybody. We're not 20 anymore where you do something and go, pooh, I won't do that again. You know, we're working with, you know, it is medicine. We're working with patients. And, you know, the goal is to educate not only the patients, but also the doctors who are recommending cannabis to their patients. And can you share, Dr. Tishler, some of the things that you've seen and some of the things that you recommend to your patients on having a drug-to-drug interaction?
Yeah, you know, so actually we did a blog post about this just a couple of weeks ago, because what we found was that there were people asking us, you know, strings of questions about various pharmaceuticals, conventional medications. And so I really dug into the literature, and what I really found was kind of interesting, that there are a lot of theoretical interactions between the THC component of cannabis and conventional medications, principally through that iso enzyme that Min had mentioned, the 3A4 iso enzyme. But what's interesting is that clinically we don't see these very often. So they're more theoretical than practical. And part of the reason for that, and this is something that Jehan had alluded to, is that some of these enzymes are busier than others, and some of them are more flexible than others, meaning if you need more, they make more. And so there's kind of this ongoing flux that creates a balance. And that's what we see more with this very popular 3A4 isoenzyme. It turns out that there are a whole bunch of these isoenzymes, and they all have these kind of funky, useless names. So there's a 2C9 and a 2C19 that are also much more involved in metabolizing CBD. And unfortunately, the CBD metabolism pathway is just less flexible. And so we see more real world interactions between CBD and conventional medications. And so a few that you mentioned, warfarin, which is a blood thinner, clopidogrel, which is a different type of blood thinner used for different things, equally important. Heart medications like amiodarone, which is one that helps regulate the rhythm of the heart. There are a whole bunch of medications that are involved in organ transplant, kidneys and livers, called tacrolimus and everolimus. All of these things can be dramatically affected by CBD, unfortunately, even at fairly low doses of CBD. And so we've seen these things go awry, whereas when we're using sort of more traditional THC dominant cannabis, it just doesn't seem to be the same kind of problem. Adam, are you seeing the same sorts of things?
Yes and no. I think, well, first I want to start by agreeing with a comment that you made, and that is that I think that a lot of these drug-to-drug interactions with respect to cannabis in general is a lot more theoretical than it is actually clinically relevant. I mean, I think that, we go through this exercise with all of our, medications. Having said that, the safety of this is an extremely important topic, and understanding drug-to-drug interactions is an extremely important topic for really several reasons. First is that, the more that we talk about it, the more that we learn, and also this is great exposure for cannabis as a medicine, because when you start talking about it in the same category as things like, our blood thinners and stuff like that, it really starts to add validity to cannabis as a medicine. But the other reason that this is important right now is because, let's face it, cannabis is under a microscope, right? So, you know, it's not going to be even though I believe that this is a lot less clinically relevant than it is theoretical. The fact that we're going through this exercise right now is important because we want to prove not only validity of medical cannabis but the safety of it. And let's face it, there's plenty of people that still want to see cannabis fail, and so they'll take any sort of potential side effect and really try to exploit it. So it's certainly up to us to be very cognizant of some of these potential safety issues and drug to drug interactions. And I think I probably have a little bit different perspective in a different way of, I guess, practicing cannabis medicine than maybe some of my colleagues. Being a surgeon, Jordan, Jehan, and you'll probably, agree that, surgeons now all the time aren't necessarily the best, medical doctors, if you will. We tend to become oftentimes a lot more technicians than as time goes on. And having said that, we have our group of medications we feel comfortable with, but there's a lot of medications that as a surgeon that I'm just simply not familiar with. And so when I'm seeing a patient for medical cannabis or I have a nurse practitioner who sees a lot of patients, we first start to really kind of lump these patients into two broad categories. The first are our hospice patients, and not to sound insensitive, but the reality of it is that we can be a little more I guess cavalier with how we dose cannabis in somebody who's simply just trying to, not have to escalate their fentanyl doses as they're ending their last few days of their life. And, obviously that's not going to be as relevant as, say a middle-aged individual who, is seeking cannabis care or wants to start to incorporate cannabis for something like their seizure disorders, and it's a very different animal and a very different population. So as I mentioned, I tend to kind of lump these patients into two broader categories. And, when I do have, an individual who's starting on cannabis, it's very important that, we go through their medication regimen. And being a surgeon, there's certain liability associated with practicing, outside of your specialty. And so I rely heavily, and I involve my medical doctors, who are the referring doctors most of the time for this, to be involved in their care. And so again, our playbook and our practice is pretty simple. We have a cheat sheet of medications. It was actually published from a journal article in 2020. That talks about a lot of these drug-to-drug interactions, and they put together a nice table that has those medications which have the most cross reactivity or cross clearance, if you will, of medications that are metabolized by the liver by the same cytochrome P450 and other liver enzymes. And if patients are on any of those medications, it automatically sends we automatically make the patient aware of that, but we also, let the referring provider aware of that as well. Because again, last thing I want to see is going back to the first rule of medicine, first do no harm. The last thing I want to see is me to prescribe a medication which could, especially something like cannabis, where, there's still a lot of people that would love to see this, have a negative outcome. I don't want to see that happen. So, so things like, of course, blood thinners, the heart medications, warfarin is a big one, digoxin, although I don't see many people on digoxin anymore. But yeah, to Dr. Tishler's comment, if people, there's people who are on, medications that there can be significant side effects. So I as a surgeon, again, I get my medical docs involved in this pretty heavily. Unfortunately, I have a nurse practitioner who is a general medical doctor herself for years ahead of time, so she has a lot of experience that can help as well. And the only other thing that the comment that I make, at least right now, about the safety is really just talking with patients about some of the potential side effects that may not be necessarily drug to drug interactions. The dizziness, the somnolence, maybe some agitation, some of these general things. They say, this is, if you've never experienced cannabis before, these are some of the things you might experience, but these could have negative side effects as well.
And you can, even there's even pharmaceutical that have drug to drug interactions. So it's important to have this conversation. Before I go back down to you, men, Adam, you being a surgeon, because this one comes up quite a bit, where you hear patients that are depending on cannabis as a medicine for whatever they're going through, if it's cancer, God forbid, or something else, that the surgeon will generally tell them to clean themselves out for what is that number? Is it 2 weeks, 10 days, 5 days, 3 days to get it out of the system before they go into surgery? And if they're going to be going under, do you have that? Is it a rule of thumb across the board in your practice?
Great question. And the answer is I do not make any recommendations about people altering their cannabis use, prior to undergoing surgery. Now, there's a medic, and I do have a lot of experience, with patients, particularly my inflammatory bowel disease patients who use cannabis. And one of the things that unfortunately, patients with inflammatory bowel disease need to get a lot of colonoscopies, and propofol is a medication which is on that drug to drug interaction list. And just today alone, I did three colonoscopies. I did colonoscopies on 3 patients with inflammatory bowel disease, and I know 2 of them who also use cannabis. And we don't see this, going back to the whole clinical relevance, we don't see, and I speak with my anesthesiologists about this all the time because we like to just chat about this stuff, but we don't see that these people are requiring either much higher doses of propofol to get through their procedures or much lower doses to get through their procedures. But so, again, it's a little bit of it's trying to use common sense, but also just, understanding risk tolerance, and everybody has, different risk tolerance when caring for patients.
I'm going to throw a little, I'm going to do a PSA here. About 6 months ago, I had my first colonoscopy. For all the men out there, for men's health, it's important to do that, but they used propofol on me, and
you don't remember a thing.
Woke up going, did that happen? They said, yeah, you're done. So I know you had your hand up, and I don't want to forget our guest Min here as well. So thanks for being part of this today, Min. But Dr. Tishler, you had a question?
Oh, I just wanted to say on this topic that Adam was just talking about, there's been a lot of discussion in the anesthesiology population about what that right number should be. And I've seen a number of departments come down to 3 days as the magic number, and they will readily admit that that's arbitrary. There was a review published, I want to say 4 or 5 months ago, that basically said you should let the anesthesiologist know that you're using cannabis, but that there's actually no reason to stop using it at the time, but you should simply be being consistent. I don't know that that's influenced the policies of the practitioners yet. So we're in that stage right now where, we need to accommodate these physicians' discomfort with an unknown while they become educated and while more data is accumulated. So I think that that's kind of that awkward position that we're in at the moment. But certainly there's nothing that suggests that people should be off it for weeks on end.
Gotcha. You brought up a good point. I don't mean to keep on the colonoscopy thing, but they never asked me. Are you on any other medications? Are you drinking? Are you using cannabis? And so that's kind of alarming right now, sitting here thinking.
Well, the amount that you get for a colonoscopy is pretty different from what you would get for general surgery.
Gotcha. So, Min, we didn't forget you. Thanks for being here. When you were in school, pharmacy school, I work with a lot of pharmacists, and so it's hit and miss on where they're located and where they went to school. California, we're both from California. I think the topic has been discussed since it's been legal here since 1996 at the medical level. You being a young pharmacist, was it you being, I guess, a young modern day pharmacist, I should say, was it discussed in school?
So I actually went to Northeastern, which is in
Oh,
Massachusetts.
there goes that theory, huh?
Yeah, and no, it wasn't. We didn't even have like a single lecture on
Wow.
cannabis, so I didn't even know the ECS existed until like 2 years ago.
But it's been legal medically in Massachusetts for a good long time too. Certainly longer ago than Min went to school. So the idea that it ought to have been taught to him during that process is still valid.
Yeah. We've done numerous, and when I say numerous, about 15 or 16 conferences with pharmacists out here in California, all CME approved. And that was at first, no one was ever discussing it. And then they said, how come we're not part of this? We have our DEA license. We're the ones helping patients. We're the ones asking and answering questions with these patients. Why aren't we involved with the cannabis sector? And and I truly believe that pharmacists should be involved with that, because the majority of doctors, unfortunately, will just say, here's your recommendation, call me in a year if you need a renewal, or good luck, go down to the dispensary and now you're a legal patient. And so with that, can you share, because for our listeners that are most of them are in the medical profession, I don't want you to be afraid to ask the questions to your patient, and I don't want the patients to be afraid to ask you about cannabis. And so all of you on this panel here, can you share some of the tidbits that you can share with your colleagues that are also in the medical practice field on having this conversation, and if you don't know the answer, what they should do?
Well, I think having talked to a few different cannabis practitioners who are mentors of mine now, the biggest takeaway for me when I got into the space was how they feel so much more comfortable recommending cannabis because of its safety profile compared to traditional synthetic medications. I mean, yes, it's harder to figure out because cannabis is botanical with multiple constituents, and it's not that single molecule, pharma drug. But if you look at the kind of big picture overall, its safety profile is a lot safer than.
That's good to know that.
I think I'll come up with a counterpoint to that and simply say, yes, if used, wisely and moderately, it's absolutely much safer than many of the medications that we use conventionally. But by the same token, the cannabis systems in pretty much every state in the United States give patients this kind of weird carte blanche to just go and buy endless supply of cannabis at the recommendation of the very conflicted bud tender or patient, salesperson who's going to push them into buying more and higher potency products over time. And we know that develops tolerance and ultimately can lead to use disorders that we wish we wouldn't get into. And so, in fact, I think that, to your question about what do our colleagues need to know, they need to know that this is much safer than many of the medications that they're used to prescribing. But by the same token, keeping an eye on your patients and working hand in glove with the pharmacist like Min, or with the cannabis specialists like ourselves, helps keep patients, getting what they need and not drifting into areas where they can get into trouble.
Can you share, because I'm the first to say that cannabis doesn't work on everyone, just like pharmaceuticals does not work for everyone. And so can you share, as you mentioned, Jordan, for your colleagues to watch your patient, see what their reactions are, see if it's working. Do they need to adjust, just like you would with other medications? And so, I mean, that's a topic, and I think it's really important, because a lot of people in this industry always say, here it is, it works. And I don't want to ever give anybody any false information, because I work with a lot of patients. Even, we did a posting on our social media, and we had a lot of people say, I've tried all that, it does not work for me too. So Jehan, you had a question. Sorry.
No, just a comment. Having these conversations, I'm not a clinician. I'm just a researcher who's happened to done some clinical research, and have definitely published case reports with clinicians and observational work looking at patients using various medications, including opioids, during their first 6 months of becoming a cannabis patient. And, some of the pain docs and such that have been involved with this, there seems to be an issue because there's limited options for good education. If you go to MedWatch, it's like every conceivable thing that could possibly interact in some way. And so I think that it puts clinicians in a space where they have to make a judgment call about what is applicable to this particular patient. And I'm happy to hear from my colleagues here. I'm just saying from what I have heard from working with clinicians in research is that there's lots of unverified data. There's lots of claims out there, and advising patients to be very careful about what they believe, and looking at, again, what information is out there and how it applies to a patient, I think is probably one of the more important aspects. And wherever you can, I like to say put brackets or put numbers, because if you say something like, oh, cannabis interferes with your sleep, well, is that 100%, or is there a percent chance of that? Just like with Epidiolex that we talked about earlier, there's thousands of adverse events reported, but there's tenfold more people using the drug that do not report those side effects. So use numbers, quantify the risk whenever possible from the literature, saying, hey, there's a common variant of SIPs, as Jordan has talked about, that's less flexible, more flexible, 30% of the population. So keep an eye out for a potential interaction or something that doesn't feel right. And just trying to put people at ease that, put numbers behind things whenever you can to give people a sense of the risk. So it's not like, 100% chance of rain today. It's like, no, it's like there's a 60% chance or 30% or high risk, low risk, things like that. But again, I'm leave it to my three colleagues here to correct any medical information I have put out.
I think you're right on the money there. And I think that, it's not even just as simple as, what is the overall risk, but it's also, how do you mitigate that? And one of the obvious answers is dosing, right? So, what is the risk of, you use the example of interrupting REM sleep? Well, the older studies, which were totally BYOC, so they had no idea what the dose was, those showed significant interference with REM sleep. But the more modern studies that control the dosing, or at least ask about the dosing, we find that at low doses you get benefit to sleep, whereas at those higher doses you saw those problems. So we can understand the risk in terms of how the medication was used, at least in the study, and then we can act accordingly for our patients.
I know we have a few minutes, and I have a couple more questions here just to honor our time here. Doctors that don't live, well, first off, two things. Doctors that are recommending cannabis that don't know anything about cannabis, and this is probably a safety thing. It's not, it's not a one size fits all, first off, and not all cannabis is created the same. And so, Jehan, let's you with the research that you've done on safety. What are the things that really stand out that a doctor or even a patient should be aware of when one recommending cannabis to a patient, or a patient taking it on themselves? I'm talking about testing and labeling, and the safety of where you get it. And it's just because a friend says, oh, it's a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend who gave it to me, and I know my friend is a good person, that doesn't always cut it. And so, can you talk about that?
Yes. I think that, again, you're right on. It's the source is one of the most important aspects to consider. How is this product handled? Maybe just to use a conceptual analogy, there are, depending on where you go in the world, you can buy eggs, right? And eggs are typically refrigerated, but depending on how they're processed and handled, they might not be refrigerated. And that freaks out some people. But when you understand the supply chain and standards and, what goes into that, people feel less safe or more safe. And likewise with cannabis, I don't think it's a great place for anyone to start if they're considering using cannabis for any reason, to start with what's available at your local corner store or gas station, because again, you're really not going to know what that is. You're not going to know what the dosing. It could be a placebo product. It could be way underdose. They could have just shown it to some delta 8 THC and there's nothing in it, really, just kind of a loose impression of delta 8 in it, and you will wildly underestimate the intoxicating properties of a product or anticipatory effects. I think that is one of the real dangers there. Is you might take a product, no effect, and then when you take a real product, you might take way too much and have a really negative experience. So I would say sourcing is great, and looking beyond just the product labeled. I can print out a label on my computer and put it on something, doesn't mean it's accurate. Really think about where you are purchasing this product from, and also, is the staff knowledgeable? I think that maybe they don't know the entire ethnobotanical history of cannabis and every ancient use of it, but they know how the product was handled, how it was stored, how it was prepped. They can connect you with resources. And obviously, it's not always a great idea to go to your friends, but if you do have a community that has experience, and some dispensaries do offer patient counseling or groups for patients to get together, and largely a lot of what they talk about is how to use these products effectively. And that is something that you can then distill out that information and share with your health professional that you work with. Again, but I think it's more and more becoming obvious that having a pharmacist at a dispensary is a great resource, especially for people who are a bit naive to cannabis, are trying to transition out of the illicit market into the regulated market, because really in the illicit market, you have no idea the potency you're getting. It might be labeled as something. I mean, I've seen illicit products in the East Coast that say they're from California. Like, is that just a marketing ploy by the illicit market, or is that true? Probably a marketing ploy. So again, always think source. It's good to be skeptical of what's on the label, just like if you're buying a vitamin or supplement.
I was going to say that, yeah. Even
looking
other items, non-cannabis items.
Like I look at the expiration date whenever I buy a little thing of creamer for my coffee, and I'm like, is this, even if it says a certain expiration date, I'm like, this is warm, maybe I won't buy this. So be a little skeptical when you read a label. And I think that's the important part. If you don't understand something, reach out first to health professionals. If there's none available, look for those patient communities and patient forums online. But be careful of marketing ambassadors for companies. You want to be wary of that, and brand ambassadors, and really try and think about who are other people in my position who are using similar products. Can I connect with them and get some support or guidance on best practices? And of course, discussing that with a pharmacist or a health professional. But again, source. Where are you accessing this? Where is it coming from? Is it produced in the state? Is it imported? What sort of testing is there? These are all things that, as a patient, you're entitled to know and you're entitled to have access to. So
and don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to ask those questions.
Yeah, that's what they're paid for. So
yeah. And I know Dr. Abodeely, you have to leave. So I have one more question here for the group, and then if you have to jump, go for it. But for the doctor, what about for the doctors that live in legal states or illegal states that feel more comfortable with their prescription pad, writing a prescription for their patients? Are you seeing success with the patients, the doctors and the patients, with the doctors writing a prescription of Marinol prescription and Epidiolex? Because I hear a lot of doctors would prefer doing that and feeling more comfortable writing a prescription to do so if they live in an illegal state and that's all they have access to, or if they live in a legal state and that's what they prefer doing. Have you run across that with in your practice?
Well, in New York State, we don't write prescriptions. They're certifications. They're basically recommendation.
But even prescription, you're not writing a prescription for Marinol or a prescription for Epidiolex?
No, for Marinol and Epidiolex, correct. We are. And I've seen a shift, at least. Well, first, given the challenges, or I guess the extra hurdle that's involved, and we can't just write a prescription. It certainly has deterred some physicians from wanting to do it, because after they've seen the process. But what we have seen is on the oncology side is a lot less prescribing of the Marinol and more referrals for cannabis. And I think a lot of it is just because one is, I think the data supports that it's, equally, if not much more effective than Marinol for what it's being used for. But also a lot of it's driven from the patients themselves, who say, I used this, my friend gave this to me, my relative gave this to me, and I want to get cannabis legally. And so that's why they end up, in our practice.
Gotcha. And Jordan, you were going to add to that.
Well, I think that the idea of being able to write a prescription is not only comfortable, but has a significant history of benefits, right? I mean, we ultimately want our patients to get the medicine that they need in the dose that they need, and writing a prescription relatively ensures that. At least it ensures that it doesn't get derailed at the point of sale. And in the cannabis world, with these recommendations, we don't see that, and we see problems arise with people getting misled and upsold at the dispensary. So I did, in fact, try to integrate Marinol and some CBD products into my practice briefly, but what I found was it was not effective, and that cannabis, I hate to say the je ne sais quoi, but I don't know what it is at this point. I don't think anyone does, but cannabis is in fact more effective on a milligram per milligram dose than Marinol, which of course is only the THC component. I have in fact tried using prescription Marinol supplemented with full spectrum hemp extract CBD products, which, if you think about it, should be everything in the cannabis plant except the THC, and then you add the Marinol and there's your THC, so you should have cannabis. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
And that's why I brought that up, because I do know doctors that prescribe that because that's all they have access to. They'll prescribe Marinol, and then they'll say, here, go out and get a hemp CBD product.
Yeah, it's a lovely theory, but in practicality, it doesn't work, and I can't tell you why.
Yeah.
Well, my pharmacology background, like that's one of the things we actually used to debate when we were throwing drugs on cannabinoid receptors and analyzing them in the lab. And, I think the best rationale I got is actually all around us. I mean, the DEA describes it as tetrahydrocannabinols, right? There's our first clue, right? Is that there are more than one version of THC, and recent events or anything is that people are starting to figure this out, that there are a lot of versions of THC. And I think that, Jordan, might be partially what you're looking at, is there's all these isomers of THC, and the naming of it isn't precise as we'd like it to be. The naming has changed a little bit over time. And so if I remember correctly, Marinol is the minus trans isomer, which is a very potent isomer of THC, one of the more potent ones. So I guess, people on paper in the 70s were like, hey, this looks like the most potent form of THC. This should be the most effective. Let's give it to people. And that's what moved it into, approval in the 80s, I think, was that they were looking for whatever had the best efficient interaction at the receptor, which may not be the best substance to use for a therapeutic effect if it has too many, if you have a full agonist interaction with the receptor, it might go from euphoric to dysphoric. It's not always a great time to hit the receptor as hard as possible. And so I think with the plant, you're getting a mixture of these isomers, minus plus isomer, plus minus. You're getting all these different things that interact with CB1 with different efficiencies. So you're getting a nice kind of mild salsa, not just pure jalapenos. But that's more theoretical and conceptual, Jordan, but I just kind of wanted to say I agree, and this is like the best rationale I can come up with, is that it is indeed a specific isomer of THC, not a couple different ones with varying potencies, because we don't, dispensaries aren't testing for minus trans THC. They're testing for tetrahydrocannabinols, and they come out as a peak on a chromatogram that is calculated into a percent of THC on the product.
That's a good point. I like that explanation. It'd be nice to see if we could get to the point where we actually can nail down whether that's right or not, but we'll get there.
We'll do a blind taste test. It'll be fine.
I love it.
Hey, Min, question for you. With you being a pharmacist, do you see more pharmaceutical companies jumping in this sector of plant-based whole plant medicine cannabinoids?
Well, I guess we see that with Epidiolex in the sense that it is botanical.
Yeah.
So it's the um,
But after them,
botanically derived. And then there's Zativex, but it's not approved here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Will I see pharmaceutical companies getting into the space? Yes, because
Yeah.
it's like a $50 billion total addressable market. So yeah, I do see it.
Well, good to know. So, like to add anything else, Dr. Tishler?
Nope, I think we did a great job today, guys. Thank you so much for your participation.
Always a pleasure to be part of this, and being part of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. And let's give a shout out to the ACS as well on how any of our listeners right now can partake in this and join the ACS.
Yes, so please, if you're interested at all in this subject, you should know that the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists is available. We have a website that you can go to, which is cannaspecialist.org. And we have a bunch of resources that are available freely, as well as for members. We have a whole range of educational material ranging from sort of the quick and dirty handbooks that tell you sort of how to approach certain disease states, to our clinical reference library, which gives you the scientific rationale for all of that. And then of course, we additionally have a 20-hour soup to nuts educational course that you can take. So please visit us again at cannaspecialist.org.
I appreciate that. So this is Dr. Jordan Tishler here, Dr. Jehan Marcu. We have Dr. Abodeely, who had to jump off, and Dr. An. So thank you for being a guest on the show today, Dr. An. And this is John Malanka with the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, and we'll see you next time at our Casual Conversations. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.